This aircraft is spinning out of control. For most aircrews, this experience can be terrifying and even deadly. However, some aviators pursue out-of-control flight again and again. Pilots that explore the limits of both man and machine. These dizzying out-of-control missions are the realm of a special breed of aeronaut. Part fighter jock, part engineer, they are the test pilots. It's a pilot's worst nightmare, falling hundreds of meters per second and sometimes spinning wildly, hurtling towards the ground. This terrifying experience is known as out-of-control flight or departure, and it's a leading cause of death among US naval aviators. In the last 10 years, over 30 US Navy fighters were lost to departures, killing 10 pilots. Making sure this catastrophic event doesn't happen is Rob Newarner's job, and this is his office.
Rolling. Pedal. Speeds up. Control switch. Back.
Rob is a senior test pilot at the Naval Air Warfare Center in Patuxent River, Maryland.
Yeah.
A veteran of over 10 years of test flight, Rob has never had a serious accident. He plans to keep it that way.
Certainly, the large majority of people that I run into think that test pilot, wow, that must really be exciting. And I have to tell them that, well, no, actually, we work very hard to make it unexciting. Exciting flight test is a bad thing.
For the past 2 years, he's been test flying the US Navy's new air superiority fighter, the A-18E Superhornet.
What it is we're trying to accomplish in a new fighter aircraft is an airplane that is more lethal, an airplane that's going to achieve more in a campaign in terms of targets that are neutralized or killed over the course of operations, and more survivable as well, airplanes that are going to make it back to the ship after those missions.
The Super Hornet is a technological marvel designed to lead the Navy into the 21st century. The fighter can exceed twice the speed of sound, over 2,000 kilometers per hour, and still outmaneuver and kill any enemy aircraft in the sky. Rob's mission is to test the limits of the aircraft and help the designers eliminate any flaws in the new fighter before it reaches the production line. Commander Newarner's current tests call for him to deliberately attempt to send the Super Hornet into a departure to learn how the plane responds and find out how the pilot regains control.
Nose is straight down. Little bit of roll, itty bitty roll. And it's complete. Power's up. All right, let's go get ready for a little more base three.
Often, a departure will lead to a spin and a potentially deadly predicament for an untrained aviator.
Our desire in flight testing, particularly out-of-control flight, is to make sure that the 23, 24-year-old lieutenant who has 10 hours in the airplane is not going to be surprised by anything. You know, what he gets into inadvertently, we want to have seen deliberately.
It is precisely this element of surprise that makes out-of-control flight so dangerous.
The typical reaction of a fleet pilot is to panic. This is not an environment he spent any time in. He was probably looking over his shoulder at somebody he was fighting against or a target he was looking for, and the next thing he knows, his airplane swapped ends. So he really doesn't have the wherewithal to properly analyze the situation or respond to it. And that's why it's so crucial for us that recovery procedures be something very simple. The first couple of times that I went and spun the airplane, I was apprehensive about spinning the airplane. But after a while, you just become accustomed to this is the way the airplane behaves, and learning what the airplane feels like in different regimes, and it's just another way of going flying.
Today's test explores a new area of the flight envelope. The Super Hornet will be fully loaded with weapons and gas tanks on its wings. This heavy configuration is notoriously unstable, a condition where pilots often run into trouble. Today's flight is scheduled for 2 p.m.
Good morning, guys. Good morning. Well, the typical routine on any given flight day starts with walking in the door and checking the flight schedule to make sure your name's on it and to make sure you understand what time your briefs are.
All right.
Is our weather going to improve today?
Nope. Supposed to get some rain sometime this afternoon.
There are 7 new Super Hornets in the test program. 5 E models that seat 1 pilot, and 2 F models, or 2-seaters. Each aeroplane is dedicated to exploring a different aspect of the flight envelope. Speed, vibration, strength, weapons, avionics, maneuverability, and carrier operations. The Patuxent River Test Facility even includes an aircraft carrier launch catapult built on the ground. Aircraft E4 is tasked with exploring high angles of attack and out-of-control flight. The term angle of attack, or alpha, is simply the angle of flight. Very steep angles can lead to stalls, departures, and even spins.
Could result in inverted spins.
Flight cards are the script for the test mission. In spite of all the advanced technology, pilots still strap this pad to their leg and reference them during a flight. Today's flight includes several intentionally risky maneuvers, such as the tail slide.
What we do during a tail slide is point the airplane straight up and then just wait until the airspeed goes to 0. Then the airplane will birds or falls in some manner because it just no longer is flying.
Spins can take a variety of forms, such as the flat spin, the inverted spin, or the falling leaf. All spins can be life-threatening. Test pilots go to school to understand this aerodynamic phenomenon. Commander Jerry Gallagher teaches departure control at the Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River.
As you approach high angles of attack and get near the stall, we find one of the main departure tendencies is from the lateral control. Normally, if an airplane has ailerons, surfaces out on the wingtips, and you want to roll in a particular direction, it drops the control surface on that outboard wing. What happens typically at high angles of attack is that generates a lot of drag on that outward wing, and it's so much drag that it begins to pull the airplane's nose in the opposite direction that you wanted to roll. Now, there's another characteristic called dihedral effect that tends to make the airplane roll away from the relative wind. So if you combine those two, you want to roll left, you drop on the right side, it pulls the nose to the right, then dihedral effect makes the airplane roll opposite to the way you intended it to go. Well, typically, if you're in a tactical maneuver and you're trying to roll and the airplane is hesitating, it's indicating that to you. But you can see that if you really wanted to roll, you might try harder to the point where finally you lose complete control of the roll in the direction you want to go, and the airplane then departs control flight and goes in the opposite direction.
The work being done on out-of-control flight is particularly important to the Navy. Departures have been a common problem with their previous top-of-the-line fighter, the F-14 Tomcat.
The F-14 community has experienced a spin or out-of-control flight loss on the order of 1 one a year to one every other year over the life of the airplane. And so out-of-control flight is something that's received a lot of attention in the F-14 community, in great part from a perception that once the airplane winds up out of control, that it's unrecoverable.
This startling footage from July 1979 shows an F-14 departure test gone horribly wrong. The F-14 has entered a treacherous flat spin.
20,000 feet. 826, hit the battle switch, recover. Follow the rudder.
Ground control is imploring the pilot to begin recovery.
A flat spin. 20,000 feet, recover, left rudder.
He tries, but the plane won't stabilize.
15,000. Left rudder, battle switch.
After falling 5,000 meters, the pilot makes an agonizing decision. He ejects, losing the $50 million aircraft, but saving his life.
As long as you recognize what's going on and can apply the proper recovery controls, and you have enough altitude to recover, then there's no reason to assume that they're going to be fatal. One problem is that sometimes when the airplane goes through these violent maneuvers, the engines quit. Even if you recover from the spin, you may not have enough altitude to relight the engines to be able to save the airplane.
Often during the test cycle, the engines are inspected for the effects of the extreme stress created by departures. The departure test must be carried out in clear skies at high altitude above 13,000 meters. So if the engine flames out, Rob will be able to see the airfield and have time to glide home. It's rare, but test pilots are trained to handle this unusual kind of ride. E4 is fitted with special safety equipment that makes it possible for the plane to make this long glide without engine power.
We need batteries to power my electrical displays. We need a hydraulic system in order to power the stabilators and the rudders. I need an oxygen system because normally the engine provides my oxygen. And then the system is rounded out by the spin parachute, which in the event that we wind up in a situation where we can't recover from a departure or spin, we can deploy the parachute, which straightens the aircraft out, cut the parachute away, and then fly home.
To date in the Super Hornet program, the anti-spin parachute has only been deployed to test the mechanism. No test pilot has needed to trigger it. Rob Niewarmer hopes he won't be the first. It is now just 5 hours before the test flight. These are the Blue Angels, the US Navy's precision demonstration team. They fly the original F-18 Hornet, the precursor to the Super Hornet being tested today. The FA-18 strike fighter first joined the fleet in 1982. Today, there are more than 2,000 Hornets in service with the US Navy and Marine Corps. These original FA-18s, designed as models A to D, were fine aircraft. But the Super Hornet is being designed to dramatically expand the original Hornet's capabilities. Fred Madenwald is Boeing's chief test pilot on the Super Hornet program, but he is well acquainted with the original FA-18.
I could spend a lot of times telling you good things about the A through D, having flown the airplane tactically and also as a test pilot. It was the airplane that if you ever wanted to be in a knife fight with somebody else, that's the airplane of choice right there. It could turn on a dime, and it had the power package to be able to use it at high angle attack. The engines worked well. The cockpit was set up for the first time ever in a glass display technology, heads-up display, all integrated. It minimized the time the pilot had to come back into the cockpit to check on things. You could really point and shoot with that airplane.
There was just one drawback. Pilots found that when the original FA-18 was loaded with a full complement of weapons, it was unable to handle high angles of attack. After several accidents, the aircraft was found to be prone to departure or loss of controlled flight. The hope is that the new Super Hornet will be far more departure resistant and able to handle large payloads. The program to design and build the Super Hornet began in 1992. The goal was to reinvent the original Hornet, improving the range, speed, and survivability. The new fighter carries 33% more fuel, can return home with 50% more weapons, and although it's 25% larger, its radar signature is considerably smaller than the original Hornet. The first prototypes were constructed at Boeing's St. Louis factory in less than 3 years, a record for such a complex fighter. Meanwhile, at General Electric's Lynn, Massachusetts plant, the engines were being built. Then subjected to more than 12,000 hours of ground testing before they were fitted into the Super Hornet's fuselage. After its first flight in November 1995, a gradual build-up of the test envelope began. Testing a new aircraft before it goes into full production usually takes 3 to 5 years. Process can be risky, but the test program is designed to manage that risk.
We started with very simple inputs, simple deflection of a rudder, simple deflection of a stick. We moved then into spins, deliberate spins, and then finally into aggravated inputs where we thought we would see departures potentially, and inadvertent spins. Now all of this is prefaced by several years worth of wind tunnel work and simulation trying to determine where do we think the trouble spots are going to be before we get to flight test.
Only Commander Niewarner and Fred Madenwald are entrusted with these treacherous spin missions.
Historically, spin and departure testing is a risky enterprise. Aircraft have been lost doing departure and spin testing in past programs.
This gradual buildup is critical in departure testing. Flight physiologists have determined that spins carry risks that pilots aren't always aware of. They become disorientated, their brain slows down, and time is compressed.
Time compression's real. Every time I come back and look at the video after what I think was a particularly long spin, and it seems like it's always the inverted ones, the ones where we're hanging upside down, that seem to last the longest. When I look at it on the video, I go, man, it sure seemed to take longer than that when I was in the cockpit.
Engineers have simplified the flight controls to combat the effects of spins.
The airplane can tell if it's in an out-of-control situation. We will have accurate arrows come up on the cockpit displays to show him to which way to put the stick. And so don't think, follow the arrows. And so if a pilot gets into that and goes down to about 30% brain capacity while the airplane's flipping around, all he has to do is look at one place and follow where the arrows tell him and hold him there. So he doesn't have to have a lot of spin training. He could be a music major that's flying the airplane, doing a good job, and all he has to do is look in the cockpit and follow the arrows, and then recover the airplane, come back and tell a great story at the bar.
With today's advanced fighters, often the best way to recover the plane is for the pilot simply to let go of the stick and let the flight control computers do the work. Rob Niewarner trusts the new flight control system implicitly and uses a decidedly low-tech piece of equipment to ride out the departure.
The airplane has two handles, we call them the towel racks, that are mounted on on the structural member of the canopy. I use them in order to stabilize my body during out-of-control flight where the aircraft may be tumbling, I'm being thrown around the cockpit. I'll grab the towel racks in order to stabilize my body and just wait for the airplane to finish its motion.
Danger is an occupational hazard for these aviators, but worrying about it would make the test pilot's job impossible.
The danger part of it is the thrill of the job, but you guys see more danger than I do, and I'm closer to it than you. I think the rodeo bull riders have it a lot worse. Those guys, they don't know what those bulls are going to do. You know, they turn and change motion, and those are the really experts, I guess, in motion. With us, I kind of know what this airplane's going to do.
However, there are flights that challenge even the most experienced test pilot. Several weeks earlier, Rob took this spectacular ride. Rob had aimed the aircraft straight up and then quickly pulled the stick to the right. Though he expected departure, he was taken by surprise by this violent, tumbling spin.
And it's braking, control release. Left stick. Power's up. Flight control reset. Reset. Well, that was the most interesting ride I've had to date.
This is the head-up display that recorded what Rob saw during that departure. The indicator on the right shows that he dropped more than 5,000 meters in under 30 seconds.
Braking, controls release. Flight control. Flight control. Left stick. Power's up. Flight control reset. Reset. Well, that was the most interesting ride I've had to date. Matter of fact, I think I'd like to rest for a moment. Wow.
Rob didn't become a test pilot because he craved the adrenaline rush of a dangerous flight. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and after 6 years as a fleet pilot, he went on to test pilot school. He is married with 4 sons. And although he is casual about the dangers of a test pilot's job, Rob is clearly aware of how the uncertainty affects his family.
Well, I have little boys, and so little boys are fascinated with airplanes, and so, you know, they think that's cool. My wife, she's ready for me to move on to another line of work.
But his wife will have to wait a little longer. It is now 4 hours before the test flight. To observe what happens during the flight, Rob will be followed by a fellow test pilot, Philip Yates, in a chase plane, a standard FA-18.
The chase pilot has a number of roles. I'm so consumed with what's going on in my own cockpit that I can't pay attention to where other airplanes are in the area. He's the one who's using his radar to clear the area around us to make sure that we have no conflicting traffic. Safety from the perspective of he's watching our airplane to see if anything would break off the airplane. What we're doing is very dynamic and is very stressful on the airplane, and if anything falls off, he's going to be the person who sees that happen.
To carry out its mission, the chase plane must often fly precariously close to the test aircraft. In this freak accident, a weapon dislodged from the F-18 and severed the wing of the chase plane. In this case, an A-4 Skyhawk. The stricken aircraft narrowly misses the F-18 as it spins towards the ground. The fuel tank ruptures and the bursts into flames. The pilot is still inside. He can't eject until his plane is horizontal, otherwise it is suicide. Miraculously, the pilot is finally able to eject safely. Back at flight headquarters, the test conductors, Dave Sitz and Jim Barnes, finalize the flight cards for the upcoming briefing. This final meeting for the High Alpha test team focuses on safety.
Once the brief starts, then whatever else is going on in my life and in the workplace, I have to set them aside from when the brief starts until we go man up, because we're concentrating on getting the flight out.
Highlights of maintenance since last flight, just to review. We did remove the right-hand engine, replaced it with serial number 121. That's got the smokeless combustor. As a note for today, it should have...
The briefing is a crucial part of executing the flight. It's in the briefing that the pilot, his chase pilot, the supporting engineering staff all come to an understanding of what we're going to accomplish on today's mission and how it's going to be done. The briefing then provides the foundation for everything that occurs during the flight.
Jim, however, if you hear him say recover no data...
The test pilot's job is to act as an intermediary between the engineers and the fleet pilot. Rob holds a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, and he's trained to speak the language of both.
The test pilot is the person who talks to the engineer and tries to help the engineer understand the operator's world in language that the engineer can understand. In turn, I frequently have to turn around and speak to operators, aligned fighter pilots, and speak to them the engineer's world, but in language that that operator can understand.
If I use burner liberally, then we'll typically get down.
Rob must also handle the challenging task of coherently reporting his observations as he flies each test maneuver.
Some yaw rate, 25 degrees, going to see a big side slip left and right. Spin arrows, but I'm not going to use to respond, and the airplane's flying.
This fact-finding precedent was set up by the very first test pilots, the Wright brothers. Brother Orville volunteered to fly first, agreeing to report back to Brother Wilbur, thereby setting the standards for documentation which are still followed today. The Wright brothers were not only the first test pilots, they were also the first to experience out-of-control flight.
Well, I think the Wrights were the first ones to discover departures. And if they were flying probably a little higher, they would have been the first to discover spins, I think. But they were so low that they hit the ground before the spin actually showed itself.
Early test pilots were seat-of-the-pants daredevils. Some even refused to wear seat belts. Spinning airplanes for them meant being catapulted into thin air. As airplanes became more advanced, recovering from departures and spins became more difficult. Don Engen is the director of the National Air and Space Museum. He was a Navy test pilot in the 50s and 60s, focusing on spin tests.
Pilots were adventurous and were operating these airplanes to their absolute limits. And so in this period of new jets in the mid-1950s, and where a new airplane was coming out every 18 months, we had a lot of different airplanes, and we were finding that they would spin. This became quite a challenge to everybody, and in addition to losing airplanes, we were losing pilots. So this is what really drove me to try to understand better, why were we spinning?
Then, as now, learning about departures required hours of spins.
You've got to be able to analyze everything, and so you must spin airplanes. You've got to spin again and again and again in order that you can analyze these different airplanes. One day I did 5 inverted spins. It was pretty good ride, and there were a lot of negative G-forces in it. The next day, I went to shave, and I looked in the mirror, and the whites of my eyes were totally red. I'd broken all the blood vessels in my eyeballs.
Today, all test pilots are graduates of Test Pilot School, where students are led through a rigorous academic program as well as flying. Most students are engineers, and the curriculum includes aerodynamics, propulsion theory, as well as navigation systems and flight controls.
The academic part of the curriculum is very demanding. Over the course of the year, the 48 weeks that they're actually sitting in class, it's almost 550 hours of academics. And I liken that to about 18 hours per semester at your typical university, except they're doing all these other things like flying and writing reports and writing test plans in addition to the academics.
The U.S. Navy's Test Pilot School at Patuxent River was established in 1945, and graduates include such legendary pilots as Alan Shepard and John Glenn. Rob Niewarmer graduated from the school in 1989. He recognizes his role in this new era of flight test.
If there's something that's influenced change in the flight test world, it's been the cost associated with failure. We have 7 airplanes sitting on our flight line, and they're precious. Each and every one of those 7 is precious to the program. Not just from the standpoint of there's a man's life at risk when we go flying, but from the standpoint of the program is really dependent on every one of those 7 airplanes making it through the program. Programs are so expensive that the cost of failure, the cost of losing an airplane, is so high that failure is unacceptable.
The maintenance team loads the weapons and fuel tanks onto the Superhornet. Today's maneuvers have never been tried in this heavy configuration. The emergency spin chute is thoroughly tested. It is now only 2.5 hours before the flight. Time is rapidly approaching for the F-18 experimental flight. Test pilot Rob Niewarmer final check with operations. The weather is holding for a 2 p.m. departure. The G-suit will help Rob withstand the extreme physical pressures of spin testing. The aircraft is expected to pull 6G during the mission. The integrated harness connects him to his ejection seat. Nothing is left to chance. Everyone is aware that flight testing is inherently risky.
This hangar is named for Steve Hazelrig. Captain Hazelrig was my chief test pilot when I was here at Pax River in 1990, and he died in an accident 25 miles south of here with a flight control failure. The risks are still there. They can't be eliminated. But a huge part of our role as flight test managers is minimizing the risks as much as is possible because of the lives that are at stake and the huge investment that the nation has in the airplanes sitting on that flight ramp.
Change the right engine.
Okay.
Change the right engine and get all objects and things like that.
Okay, good. Okay, pins are good.
The pre-flight check of the aircraft is the pilot's responsibility.
Checking to make sure all my doors are buttoned up tight. Struts are properly serviced. And my sensors are loose and turn freely. make sure that all my ordnance is properly secured to the aircraft. The missiles that we have on board are an AIM-9 heat-seeking missile. They weigh about 200 pounds apiece. Now all the equipment that you see on the airplane is blue, meaning that it's inert. It doesn't have a warhead or a rocket motor in it. But what it does have is a seeker head, and it has the right mass properties and aerodynamic properties for the kind of testing that we're doing today. E4, furthermore, has some unique cockpit features that most Hornets don't have. First of all, we've got the control panel for our spin chute. This is the handle where if I pull on this handle, that'll deploy the chute, turn the handle and push it back in, and that'll cut the chute away. Additionally, because digital numbers in the heads-up display are difficult to read when you're tumbling or in disorienting motion, we also have an analog angle of attack gauge and yaw rate gauge, and I use a bug to set a target so that they're up front and visible where we can look right at them as primary displays for the type of work that we do on E4.
In mission control, the flight engineers monitor the array of sensors in the Super Hornet, and the communication link to the cockpit is confirmed.
They may see a fuel pump that's failed before I see it. They may see a flight control failure that I don't see. They'll see those things, alert me to them, or tell me to take action before I have the time to even notice that something is wrong.
Engine start and taxi out are on schedule.
The sorts of things we expect to see on the flight that we've got scripted today is probably departure from control flight, which the aircraft would tumble. Responding to that is as simple generally as letting go of the stick. If the airplane from the departures enters into a spin, then two arrows come up on the displays that show me which way to move the stick. I follow the arrows. When the arrows disappear, I let go of the stick again. And everything we've seen to date, the airplane flies out. Now, we've not done the maneuvers before that we're doing today in this configuration. It is possible that those control inputs won't recover the airplane. In that event, then we'd pop the chute at 18,000 feet, and the chute will break the departure or spin, and we'll fly out of
it. In order to send this Super Hornet into departures or uncontrolled flight, Rob will actually turn off many of the automatic flight control systems and fly the aircraft manually. The takeoff is normal. The chase plane follows right behind. The control room is receiving data.
16, you got satisfactory track?
Rob moves through the first set of test cards without incident.
And stick with correct pedal.
But less than 5 minutes into the flight, Rob declares an emergency.
This mask is still leaking. Okay, we're gonna have to go back.
An oxygen leak is filling the cockpit with frigid and highly flammable gas.
Good track, show you out of 4,700, right turn, passing 100. Dude, I got a dump down. Clear to dump.
Rob must jettison his fuel to make the aircraft light enough to land. He quickly guides his Super Hornet towards the runway. He needs to be out of the cockpit as soon as possible.
And declaring emergency, I need a straight into 3-2.
contingency training kicks in, and no one panics.
Roger, say nature of the emergency. I have an oxygen leak in the cockpit. Part 4, Roger. Request field in sight. Field sight. Part 4, Roger. Request straight in for runway 32. Field sight.
The oxygen-rich environment in the cockpit is highly flammable. Additionally, the ice-cold liquid oxygen is leaking against Rob's hip. He is sitting on his flight book to prevent frostbite.
We're probably all the way down, Doctor. My concern is burning my clot again.
After what seems like an eternity, he lands E4 safely, but he still must get out as soon as possible. Back in operations, the test team is riveted to the video screens, concerned for the safety of their comrade. Rob exits the cockpit, and the crisis is over. But clearly, he is disappointed with the outcome of this test flight. He returns to the hangar as an unhappy passenger in a pickup truck and confers with the test conductor.
Whatever inspections are required for the emergency egress, does a seat need to be...
No, I didn't touch any of that stuff. I egressed normally. So.
A deadly emergency is reduced to a routine maintenance report.
The problem was actually with my personal equipment and not with the aircraft's equipment. What occurred may have damaged some parts of the airplane's system, and so we're going to have to check those out. When a leak develops in the system and the oxygen comes pouring out, it's expanding so fast that it gets very, very cold. Flesh is susceptible to frostbite, and those coldest parts are something I'm sitting on. So my concern over being burned by the cold temperatures is what caused me to want to get the airplane on deck right away and get out of the cockpit.
A debriefing is called immediately, and a phone call is placed to Boeing's offices in St. Louis.
And then, at that point, did you notice, was it already frosted up over?
Certainly that whole block there in the seat kit was not frosted over, but by the time we landed it wasn't frosted over, it was iced over. It had an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch of ice over it.
After lengthy discussions, the team is confident the problem is solved.
Never a dull moment.
He said that. I mean, it happened so quick ago. I think I don't want to get my butt burned again. I was sitting there going, I wonder what it means by that. It's really hip burned again.
Well, no.
Politely. A polite hip.
After
3 days, Rob, E4 and the weather are ready again and proceeds as originally planned.
Okay, well that's good. I would put a pressure unit to plan that straight clear to maneuver into space.
The first test point was a functional check on the engines. The newly replaced engine performs flawlessly. Then Rob executes a series of air starts where the engines are intentionally shut down, and he must try to restart them in flight. A system failure means that long glide to safety. But the engines reignite, and Rob moves through the test cards. A radar-controlled camera on the ground captures this tail slide maneuver. The F-18 is locked in a long departure, but Rob anticipates the plane's movements and recovers. But the chase plane has a problem. A light has come on, indicating landing gear is not locked up. This is probably a false alarm, because the landing gear is up, but the chase plane has to follow the rulebook and land. There is no second guessing in flight testing. According to the rulebook, Rob needs to be escorted at all times on a test flight. In this instance, a KC-130 mid-air refueling tanker qualifies as an escort. Rob decides to top up his fuel and he waits for the chase plane's replacement. Rob continues the mission and performs a series of upright spins, first at 90 degrees, then at 120 degrees. The information gained from these successful maneuvers will be invaluable in achieving the ultimate goal of the Super Hornet program. To build a fighter that is not just departure resistant, but an aircraft that is so advanced that departures will be virtually impossible. After 2 hours of controlled chaos, Rob heads for home.
The Navy's buying the Super Hornet to replace several airplanes on our flight decks, and it's going to do that magnificently. There are young men who are presently little boys who will fly this airplane into combat in the next 20 years. Maybe my boys. I have 4 of them at home. Those are the rewards. Knowing that we're participating in a program where naval aviators are going to be flying this airplane for at least 20 years off of naval aircraft carriers. It is fun, and it's very satisfying. I really enjoy going and watching the airplane improve over the course of time. And then there is certainly the aesthetic element of just enjoying going flying on a pretty day.
The success of the Super Hornet test program rests on the shoulders of courageous flyers like Rob Niewarmer. And in the future, as the next generation of aviators trains for battles yet to come, they will be flying on the wings of a test pilot.